So I ran two working groups this semester as part of the series, one on that focused on onboarding talent and another that focused on talent development and capability building. So I thought I'd maybe highlight a key takeaway from each of those. In the onboarding session, we had a lot of different discussions. Part of it was around the kind of virtual versus in-person elements, because it's gone virtual, obviously, in recent years, and companies are figuring out how much to bring back, in person. But I actually thought one of the more interesting conversations was really about how do we streamline and simplify the onboarding process for employees. I think what organizations have found is they've really kind of dug into and thought about rethinking the onboarding experience, maybe tying into some of the themes we've heard already, is about how can we make that a much better experience for our new hires. And there's a sense that in the past, employees would often receive these lengthy emails. There would often be redundant emails, really kind of overwhelmed with information early on. In addition, there was a sense that employees were being bombarded with information that really wasn't useful to them at the time. For example, they just stepped their foot in the door and all of a sudden they're being bombarded with information about various kind of benefits, retirement and things like that, that are really not kind of front and center for them at that particular point in time. And so, what organizations seem to be really focusing on is how do we streamline those communications, really simplify the process, make it much more efficient and digestible for our employees? And I think there's a few ways that we heard that are doing that. One is obviously sending all communications through a conduit so we can figure out where there's redundancies, eliminate those, and make sure employees are just getting the single source of information. Similarly, giving employees, new hires, a single point of contact so they know who to go to with questions. They don't have to kind of search around for that. Second, organizations are really adopting these centralized hubs as a kind of go-to place for all information related to onboarding. So if an employee maybe misses a communication or wants to find it later, they know where to go and they know, how to find that material. And interestingly, we even heard from some companies that they're making aspects of those centralized hubs available to employees pre-hire, right? Between the kind of offer and kind of, hire date, things like training materials and other things are providing them third-party kind of contractor access so they can get into and start taking advantage of those materials even before day one. And lastly, back to the kind of benefits example, really thinking about, when is information most timely and really kind of sequencing that information across the first 90 days or the first several months on the job so that that information gets in front of employees when they can really kind of absorb it and utilize it. So overall, the kind of takeaway was really this idea of kind of simplifying and standardizing the onboarding experience. In the talent development session, we kind of went into it really focused, thinking the focus is going to be broadly on all forms of talent development. And where the conversation really went to for most of the day was around leadership development. And companies really seem to be prioritizing leadership development in the current climate. And I think we heard a couple reasons for that. One is this sense that kind of leadership development has been somewhat neglected over the past few years, in part because leaders were stretched so thin, they had so much on their plates, there really wasn't the kind of bandwidth for them to engage in a lot of development. And so companies talked about how they have, new managers, that have been on board for months or in some cases years and have never even gone through a new manager training. So part of this is kind of catching up and backfilling some of those gaps. I think secondly is, the idea that the leadership context has changed. Leaders are increasingly having to manage broader, have broader spans of control. They're managing employees increasingly virtually, or at least part of the time virtually. And so there's this sense of we need to build new set of capabilities to really help leaders navigate this new context. And I think, back to the earlier discussions, particularly Becca's points around and Chris's around the employee experience, this idea that leaders are really the front line of that employee experience. So how do we give them the skills that they need to really shape that for their direct reports? One specific area that would seem to really be the focus of these efforts is around coaching skills, really kind of upskilling leaders at all levels on coaching, and not so much performance coaching, but really more around how do we coach employees, and just generally create an environment where we can listen to employees, where we create psychological safety for employees to feel open in terms of bringing up issues or problems with us, and being kind of having this more collaborative relationship with our employees, as opposed to a kind of top-down command and control model. And so I think, that was certainly a key priority around the talent development space at the moment.